Hello, so today we're going to talk about the anterior part of the eye. We're going to discuss its general structure and some features. So we know that eye is one of our special sense organs. It conveys information from the outside world to our brain via the sensory receptors, the eye. And the eyes are actually very photosensitive. And we have three main layers of the eye. We have the fibrous layer, the vascular layer, and the sensory layer. Now, the thing is, the fibrous layer, and each of these layers has two main parts, two to three main parts to it. For example, the fibrous layer. So, the fibrous layer it's from outermost to innermost. The outermost is the fibrous layer, which is the sclera and the cornea. The vascular layer, the middle layer, has choroid, the ciliary body, as well as the iris. And the innermost layer, the sensory layer, it has the retina as well as the optic nerve. Do not worry, we will talk about most of it in this video lecture. Now we're gonna talk before we dig into the eye itself and the anterior part of the eye. We need to know about the difference between the anterior and the posterior cavity or the posterior part of the eye. So the anterior cavity or the anterior part of the eye, it has two main chambers to it or two main subparts to it, the anterior chamber as well as the posterior chamber. So the anterior chamber is basically the area between the cornea and the iris. Yeah, this is where we see the aqueous humor, and we also have a posterior chamber where which is seen between the iris and the lens. So from cornea to lens is the anterior cavity, and the posterior cavity is all the way from it's behind the lens. It's all the way to the retina, and it has vitreous body. It has vitreous humor, which is a different kind. So we have two main we talked about just a couple of things here right now, very briefly. So we have an anterior cavity and a posterior cavity. Anterior cavity is an aqueous humor. Posterior cavity is vitreous humor. The posterior cavity itself, it has distance from the lens all the way up to the retina, whereas the anterior cavity, it has an anterior and a posterior chamber. The anterior chamber goes from the cornea to iris, and posterior goes from the iris to lens. Yeah, it goes from the iris to lens. So, like we talked about the layers of the eye, we're gonna talk about the fibrous layer and the vascular layer mainly in this video lecture. So, the fibrous layer. So we have the fibrous layer, like we talked about, it has two main parts. It has a cornea and a sclera. So cornea is the anterior portion to it, and anterior transparent portion, and the limb, and then we have the sclera, the posterior opaque, like outer layer to it. Yeah, and we have a connecting structure between the two, also known as the limbus, right? So that's how we're gonna discuss it. That's how we're gonna discuss it. So the cornea. So we're gonna go from po- uh, post posterior to anterior. So the sclera. So the sclera is rather opaque. It is a fibrous outer layer, and it contributes to about the posterior 5/6 of the eye itself, and it is a very delicate structure. It is basically nothing but dense connective tissue because it is protective in nature. It is an outer layer, so most of the time the outer layer is going to be protective in nature. That's going to be a very common function. It is vascularized, and it is dense connective tissue, and it is white in color simply because of the fact that it has type 1 collagen fibers. So now this could be asked as a one mark question, like, so the difference between the sclera and cornea. So the cornea is transparent, it's in the anterior part of the eye, the sclera is posterior, it is white in color, it has like a protective function because of the fact that it is dense connective tissue, right? Now the posterior region of the sclera itself, now the sclera is found posteriorly, and it just merges with the optic nerve, and it just converges with the optic nerve, and it surrounds the area around it, like the choroid, the sclera, the suprachoroid lamina. This is just general information that you do not need to know right now, because we're going to talk about it soon. So one takeaway from this, from sclera, that you would want to do is, like, in a nutshell, if you may. Sclera is the outermost layer. It is dense connective tissue. It has type 1 collagen fibers, It is the posterior 5/6 and it is white in color. Okay? Now we have another structure known as the limbus. So the limbus is just a structure that joins the cornea to the sclera. So the limbus, it actually encircles the cornea and it actually encircles. So before we talk about the limbus, I think it's better if we talk about the cornea because the cornea is one of the most important parts here. So let's talk about cornea and then we'll get back to limbus in a while. So the cornea itself, like we talked about, it is the transparent avascular one interior 1/6 of the eye, as opposed to the sclera, which was opaque, the posterior 5/6, and it was vascularized. So cornea, that's those are like three main differences between the cornea and the sclera. And to the cornea itself, we have like five main layers. So we have the epithelium that surrounds. It's basically it's non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's not very thick. It's just around 5 to 6 layers of these cells. It's not that thick. And the thing is, these corneal epithelium, it has basal cells which have high proliferative capacities for like regeneration of the cornea. And they're supplied by they're supplied by nerves, but they are not vascularized. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. So the next layer is the anterior limiting membrane, also known as the Bowman's membrane. So the anterior limiting membrane is just beneath the corneal epithelium, right? It's just beneath the corneal epithelium and it just provides strength to the cornea. Because the thing is, these limiting membranes just are like supporting membranes. So they provide protection, like from if there is like infection, it provides protection to the corneal epithelium. It provides strength to the corneal epithelium. It provides stability to the cornea itself. Now, the main part is underneath. So, at the outermost is the corneal epithelium. Underneath it is the Bowman's membrane. And underneath the Bowman's membrane, we have the stroma. Now, the stroma is nothing but we know that it's just connective tissue. Now, it just is connective tissue and it has special cells known as keratocytes. Now, these keratocytes, what they do is they actually have luminescence, which basically they have keratin sulfates and chondroitin sulfates, which are basically like along with proteoglycans. And what these keratocytes do is that they help maintain the precise organization. So you know how I mentioned that cornea is actually transparent whereas the sclera is not. The reason cornea is transparent to begin with is because of the fact that it has very like it has a special manner in which the collagen fibers are arranged to maintain its transparency. And these transparency, this order is actually maintained by keratocytes, which are found in the stroma. So that is the main feature of the stroma. The layer underneath it is actually the posterior limiting membrane, also known as the Descemet's membrane. It's just another basement membrane that provides stability and support to the stroma, to the endothelium. And the next one is the endothelium. So now the endothelium is actually simple squamous endothelium. And now this membrane again, it also supports all of these layers. They support each other. They provide stability to each other so as to maintain the shape and the structure of cornea to begin with. Now the endothelium, it basically maintains, it helps in regulating the ion state of the cornea. It helps in providing hydration to the cornea. So that's the main function. So because if the cornea is well hydrated, that will also contribute to its transparency and help in optimal reflection of light. So that's about it. So we have five main layers: epithelium, anterior limiting membrane, stroma, posterior limiting membrane, and endothelium. Right? I hope that made sense. I hope that really made sense. Now let's get back to limbus. So now the limbus is actually a structure that connects the cornea and the sclera. It usually is found encircling the cornea. And now in limbus, what we see this in limbus, we actually observe different like changes, different variations in the Bowman's and the Descemet's membrane. And why do we see them? We'll talk about them. So first of all, around the Descemet's membrane, which is the anterior limiting membrane, we can see that the Bowman's, yeah. So as we know that the epithelium is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and the anterior limiting membrane is just another membrane with the same epithelium. So what happens is, but at the limbus, what actually happens is now this membrane gets more and more stratified and helps in the formation of conjunctiva. Now, this is another organ that we will be discussing about in upcoming video lectures. Another thing is and another variation that we also observe with Descemet's membrane is where it forms a trabecular meshwork because for the flow of blood. Yeah, sorry, no. So yeah, so the Descemet's membrane actually varies. We see a variation where it becomes from the simple squamous epithelium and it variates and it forms a trabecular meshwork. This is to facilitate the flow of the aqueous humor in the anterior chamber of the eye, and it moves to the scleral venous, like it moves to the Schlemm's canals, where we also see the emptying of blood vessels. So that's about the fibrous layer. Fibrous layer has three main parts: cornea, limbus, sclera. Cornea transparent, avascular, anterior. Five main parts: epithelium, anterior limiting membrane, stroma, posterior limiting membrane, endothelium. Limbus, a connecting bridge between the cornea and the sclera. It actually, we see the variations in the Bowman's and the Descemet's, like these subbasement membranes. We see the variation. And sclera is just the posterior part. It's dense connective tissue. It merges with the optic nerve. So that's the fibrous layer. In the anterior part of the eye, I would also like to mention that in the anterior part of the eye, we mainly see the fibrous layer and the vascular layer. We usually see the fibrous layer and the vascular layer. And in the posterior part of the eye, we see the photosensitive layer. All right. So we're going to talk about the vascular layer. So the vascular layer, it has another name. It's known as uvea. So if you get it in a question, what is uvea? Do not get confused. It is nothing but the vascular layer or the middle layer of the eye. So it has three main parts to it. It has a choroid, a ciliary body, and an iris. So the choroid is the most posterior structure that a bit anterior to the structure is ciliary body, and the anterior most, I would say, is the iris. I'm sorry, this picture is very blurry and I know you cannot see it. I will send this presentation with it so you can actually see it on your own when as I'm explaining. So the choroid, as we talked about, is the posterior two-thirds of the eye. It is just loose connective tissue, right? It is loose connective tissue, and this choroid, it actually has melanocytes because of the fact that it forms the choroid. Like the easiest way I would say to describe choroid in a line is the fact that it is loose connective tissue and it has melanocytes. We know melanocytes are pigment producing cells. Now these melanocytes actually form a black layer in the choroid, and this actually helps prevent like any this ensures that the light only enters the pupil and not anywhere else. So the pigment is ensuring that the light only enters in the pupil, not elsewhere. So inner line choroid is loose connective tissue with melanocyte. It has two layers. It has a choriocapillary lamina and it has a supporting Bruch's membrane. So the choriocapillary lamina is just an inner layer. It provides nutrition to the retina and it is very well vascularized. Now the Bruch's membrane is outer, so it's extracellular. So its outer layer, it has different kinds of fibers like collagen fibers and elastic fibers, and it surrounds the microvasculature. It surrounds the vasculature, and it surrounds the pigmented layer of the retina. That is something that you will learn. You will talk about the retina and its different layers in another video lecture. Right? So this is what you need to know about the choroid. The next is the ciliary body. So the ciliary body is actually located anteriorly and it's located anterior to the choroid but posterior to the limbus. It encircles the lens. So what the ciliary body does in a nutshell is basically it controls the shape and the size of the lens in one line. So the ciliary body itself has ciliary muscles, ciliary processes, ciliary zonules. So the ciliary muscles itself, like these are like we have three main ciliary muscles. They are smooth muscles and they make up most of the stroma. They help with accommodation as well as the shape of the lens. Like we mentioned, they mentioned that they ciliary body itself has three main parts: the ciliary muscle, the processes, and the ciliary zonules, all of which help with the accommodation or like changing the shape and size of lens according to the object we're seeing. according to what we're seeing, right? So ciliary muscles, we have three smooth muscle cells that help with the accommodation. Next, we have the ciliary processes. So these are just processes. So these are like radially arranged processes that that originate from the ciliary body itself, and they actually also help in changing the shape of the lens. And another thing is we see that the ciliary processes that we have, they actually they have cells. So the thing is the ciliary processes, they provide a large surface area. And they provide a large surface area so by because they cover like epithelium, they cover the epithelium of the lens, and because of which what actually happens is that it forms many basolateral folds with like potassium and sodium, which helps facilitate the release of aqueous humor. So the aqueous humor. So where is the aqueous humor originated? It originates and it's secreted by the ciliary processes, not by the ciliary body. Okay, and the flow of aqueous humor is from like it goes from the ciliary process, it goes to the posterior chamber, to the pupil, through to the anterior chamber, from where it goes to through the trabecular meshwork into the scleral venous sinuses or the Schlimm's canal. The last but not the least, the ciliary zonules. So the ciliary zonules are just fibers. Again, these are just fibers. They have different kinds of fibrillin 1 and 2. These are just names of proteins that are found. And this actually, the main function of ciliary zonule is simply the fact that it holds the lens in its place. So the lens does not move because as we walk, the lens does not like move or it doesn't shake us. That would give us blurry vision and would lead to a certain like number of other problems. So this is what holds it in place, the zonule. Right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the iris. So the iris is the anterior most extension of this vascular layer. It has no epithelium to itself and it covers the lens except for the pupil because pupil is where the light and where the light enters the eye, and it has layers of like fibroblasts and melanocytes, but it has no epithelium, which is a very important thing because in the nostalgical slide you would not see an epithelium, and that is something that a lot of people would miss. So it can be something that you can just know, a little trick, I would say. And as you move deeper, it has just loose connective tissue with like melanocytes and fibroblasts, and it is well vascularized. But it is, I would say, the vasculature as we move deeper into the stroma decreases. And the posterior surface of iris is like as we talked about how iris has melanocytes. We know that these melanocytes they produce a black layer even in the choroid in the posterior part, so that they ensure that the light enters only through the pupil and not elsewhere. It also has myoepithelial cells, which are partially pigmented. They are smooth muscle cells. They help in like it forms different kinds of muscles like the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae. It helps in dilating and constricting the pupil, which helps according to the strength of the light that we're exposed to, and the reason is the melanocytes of the iris determine the color of the eye. So the melanocytes that we talked about, they determine. So that's why some people have blue eyes, some people have green eyes, some people have brown eyes. That's about it. And I hope that made sense. Thank you so much.